look at this and say, what's really going on here? That's their responsibility.
Speak for the taxpayers. They'll speak for themselves.
Every nurse to take care of patients. You have to be there for the patient.
Today, we'll be discussing the Winkler County whistleblower case. It's 2009, Kermit, Texas, Winkler County Memorial Hospital. This is a small hospital. Doctor walks in, he's immediately hit with a complaint. Hey, somebody said that you're endangering your patients. This letter was anonymous, and this was brought to the state's medical board. That's it. That's all they told him. He's fuming. Why would somebody report me to the state's medical board? Who on earth would do this? He calls the sheriff. He tells the sheriff what happens. A criminal investigation is then started that very same day. He and the sheriff are dumbfounded when they discover who sent in this report. And once they did learn who it was, they'd go on to do anything and everything they can to make sure that person is punished. And I'm not just talking just lose their job punished. I'm talking felony charges, locked up behind bars punished. This was actually something that happened in Kermit, Texas. And it would send shockwaves not just through an entire city, not through an entire state, but through the entire country and medical field. A doctor, a hospital administrator, a sheriff, and a county attorney all cleverly and calculatedly worked together to throw 2 nurses in jail for making a report to save patients who are in danger. The reason behind why they even did all of this is seriously just one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. And this controversial case would leave an entire community divided on who was right and who was wrong in this situation. But before we get into this case, just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything medical, mysteries, and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. But before we get into this case, I'd like to take a minute to get into the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. Anytime you connect to a Wi-Fi network in public, or even when you're simply scrolling online in the comfort of your own home, you unfortunately are at risk of your device being exposed to people who could quite literally steal your data. But with a VPN like Surfshark, you're able to better protect your information in public and ensure security and privacy whenever you're browsing online. I know for me, I'm always on my laptop in public, whether it be studying or even researching for cases. So having a VPN like Surfshark and utilizing things like their antivirus feature, for example, is definitely helpful in making sure my data stays protected so I can continue researching and sharing all these videos with you. From November 8th to January 1st, Surfshark will be running a special Black Friday and holiday campaign where they're offering 4 extra months at a significantly lowered price. You can head to my link at surfshark.com/petalpalmer for 4 extra months of this deal. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, and this is a special deal that won't come around again anytime soon. So you might as well take advantage and use the link for 4 extra months of Surfshark at a lower price. The link will be in the description. Thank you, Surfshark, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get into this case. Winkler County Memorial Hospital was a hospital founded in 1948 in the city of Kermit, Texas. Kermit, Texas is a pretty small town in the Winkler County of Texas, having just about 5,200 residents at the time of this case and 6,200 in 2020. Just about 46 miles or 74 kilometers from Odessa, Kermit is a town known as a main supply center of oil. And fun fact, its water tower actually has a painting of Kermit the Frog's face on it after he visited in 2005. It was just in 1910 when the county, Winkler County, was officially organized in Kermit. And it was that same year when the first public school and post office opened there. It was growing just fine as a town. It was, however, when a 1916 drought happened when many residents were forced to leave the town. This decline in population continued all the way up until the 1930s, but thanks to the Texas oil boom, towards the late 1930s, their population started growing tremendously. It was with this growth in not just population, but in businesses when they began developing more buildings required to run a town or city. And this is when they created the infamous facility of this case, the Winkler County Memorial Hospital. In 1948, 2 private practices were closed down in Kermit to then open the hospital. Starting off with just about 35 beds and only a couple doctors, this hospital was the only place available for residents of Kermit to get treatment for anything. Whether it was you had a cough or if you sprained your ankle, you would go to Winkler Memorial to get treated. As the years went by, the hospital developed new facilities, including a rural healthcare clinic in 1995, and eventually eventually in 2000, they gained designation as a critical access hospital. As a critical access hospital, this meant that they were a part of a program established in the United States in 1997, allowing hospitals in rural areas to offer services such as emergency care that would otherwise only be available at a farther hospital. After receiving about $12 million in funding, in 2008, they officially finished construction of a new and improved facility for the hospital, and this allowed them to continue offering services in labs, pharmacy, physical therapy, radiology, emergency medicine, and even inpatient care. As a small hospital, Winkler Memorial didn't have and still currently doesn't have a dedicated surgery unit. They have the emergency department, which has the ability to treat and stabilize patients, but for anyone requiring any kind of specialized procedures, they would need to be sent to a different hospital in the closest big city, Odessa. In 2011, Winkler Memorial was designated as a Level 4 trauma center. According to the American Trauma Society, there are 5 levels of trauma centers, with level 4 being that the facility, quote, has demonstrated an ability to provide advanced trauma life support prior to transfer of patients to a higher level trauma center. It provides evaluation, stabilization, and diagnostic capabilities for injured patients. So this means Winkler Memorial has the ability to stabilize patients who are seriously injured before they get transferred to Odessa or another hospital to get specialized care there. This is something that is of important note for this case. Currently, Winkler Memorial is a 19-bed facility, and I've seen different numbers cited, but at the time of the case, they had anywhere between 15 to 25 beds. And something that has remained consistent from when they started till now is that they often have only a few physicians working there at a time. According to journalist Saul Albine in his article Intent to Harm on the Texas Observer, the main reason cited for this is that it was hard to find a physician who would commit to living in Kermit permanently. So a lot of the time, doctors, especially ones who recently finished their program looking for work, would pick up the position, they'd work for a few years, and then once they found something in a city they'd prefer to live in and work in, they'd leave to go work there. While this was something that consistently happened with the doctors at the hospital, regarding the nurses on the other hand, there were nurses who stayed at the hospital for many years. These nurses played a tremendous role in showing the doctors the ropes and making sure the hospital was running how it needed to be. And of these nurses included a woman named Ann Mitchell and a woman named Vickilyn Galle. Nurse Ann Mitchell began working as a registered nurse in 1981, and she started working as a registered nurse for Winkler Memorial in 1986. Over time, she was later promoted to be the hospital's compliance officer, and she also worked as a backup for utilization management and co-medical staff coordinator with Nurse Vickilyn. Her responsibilities at the hospital included credentialing physicians, completing all Medicare and Medicaid applications for staff, reviewing all patient transfers, and she even reviewed patient quality issues, including performing billing audits and making sure each hospital department was in compliance with their respective regulatory agency. Nurse Vinkler Galle began working as a registered nurse for Winkler Memorial just a year after Nurse Ann in 1987, and she became a full-time employee in 1994. It was there at the hospital where she was in charge of quality improvement and utilization management, and she worked as the co-medical staff coordinator with Nurse Ann. Nurse Vickilyn's responsibilities at the hospital included making sure patients met criteria to be admitted, following patients while admitted in the hospital, and reviewing patient charts and conditions to ensure compliance with state and federal regulations. Nurse Vickilyn was also in charge of monitoring and improving patient safety and quality control, and she was responsible for preparing the medical staff minutes and coordinating medical staff agenda and meetings. So as you can see, nurses Ann and Vickilyn were very integral parts to keeping this hospital running for many years. They both were said to be good employees. There were no negative complaints on them. They did their job how they needed to, and everything was all good with these two nurses. Additionally, another person who was an integral part of the hospital was a woman named Naomi Warren. Naomi was a nurse practitioner who worked in the clinic portion of the hospital, also known as the Rural Healthcare Clinic. She had been working at the hospital for more than 10 years by the point of this case, so she had experience working with multiple physicians and staff who'd cycle through the hospital. And one of these new staff members included a man named Stan Wiley. Stan Wiley was a previous hospital administrator in a hospital in Crane, Texas. However, according to Saul Albine from the Texas Observer, he left this position under, quote, cloudy circumstances before applying and getting the position as hospital administrator at Winkler Memorial in January 2007. He was fired by the county judge at his previous hospital after a dispute, and just before he was hired at Winkler Memorial, he had been doing business selling mobile homes. Before arriving at Winkler Memorial, the hospital was flourishing. Nurse Ann described how amazing the nursing staff and doctors were and how they always provided very good care to patients. And Naomi described how even with a tight budget, their suggestions were always listened to and they never let anything affect their care of patients. Once Wiley came, Naomi stated that from the moment he had begun working at Winkler Memorial, he made it known that one of his main priorities was to not only bring in more revenue to the hospital, but also to get physicians to permanently move to Kermit to work at the hospital long term. As Wiley told Naomi about these ideas of having permanent physicians work at the hospital, she was listening, but she of course had her doubts regarding that being something that was actually realistic. She stated the following quote, "It's hard to get good doctors to move to a place like Kermit. I told Wiley, quality has to be our top priority because incompetent doctors hang out in rural areas." Just gonna put a note, that was Naomi's opinion based on her own experience, but of course incompetent doctors can exist in the most rural cities or in the most urban. The same way amazing doctors can exist in both rural cities and urban ones as well. That was just her experience. Wiley did actually agree with this sentiment regarding incompetent doctors, but nonetheless, he had faith in his vision for the hospital, and he was committed to making sure he got that done, no matter what he needed to do or who he needed to cross to get that to happen. At the time when Wiley was hired in January, there were only 2 doctors working at the hospital. These 2 doctors were named Sarita and Niraj Choudhury, and they were actually a husband and wife duo. The hospital did end up hiring a 3rd doctor a few months later that year in July 2007, and this doctor was named Dr. Khao Pham. Having more than one physician unfortunately wouldn't last too long though, because it was just a few months later in late 2007 when the Dr. Choudhurys left the hospital and moved to Houston, leaving Dr. Pham as the only physician there, and kind of again just reinforcing the whole temporary doctor problem they had at the hospital. Being the only physician there at the time, Dr. Pham eventually became the chief of staff at the hospital, and since there was only one physician, the hospital administrator Wiley began his hunt to find another physician to work at the hospital. This was when Wiley ended up recruiting a man named Dr. Rolando Arafiles, and soon enough in April 2008, Dr. Arafiles was hired to work as a physician at the hospital. Dr. Arafiles was a practicing family medicine physician working in the emergency room in Monahans, Texas before being hired to work at Winkler Memorial. Monahans is a small city in both Ward and Winkler County, and it's just about 23 miles or 37 kilometers from Kermit. He had been doing contract work as a doctor in various cities across Texas for 3 years by that point. And it's interesting because Wiley and Dr. Arafiles both had association from the Crane Hospital as they both worked there at some point. Now, at the hospital in Crane, Dr. Arafiles was contracted to work for 2 years, but he broke the contract and left in less than 3 months. His old hospital administrator, Bill Barnes, described there was a time Dr. Arafiles did not show up to work at the ER, and Barnes had to drive around the entire night looking for him. He also described that Dr. Arafiles complained a lot about the job. He described that Dr. Arafiles tried convincing him to enroll patients in an experimental drug trial, and he described that Dr. Arafiles used up all his vacation time in just those 3 months. Now, when Wiley was recruiting Dr. Arafiles to Winkler Memorial, he called Dr. Arafiles' reference. And you want to guess who his reference was? It was Bill Barnes. Wiley called Barnes on the phone and was like, "Hey Bill, I'm trying to hire a new physician. I know Dr. Arafiles worked with you in Crane. Could you let me know how that went?" As soon as he asked this, Barnes said that he stated, quote, "Stan, you want to stay away from him. He's trouble." They continued their conversation. At the end of it, Wiley told Barnes, "Thank you," and that was all Barnes heard regarding that. Wiley would in fact not stay away from Dr. Arafiles. Instead, he would hire him very shortly. And Dr. Arafiles would do just what Wiley had wanted a physician to do at the hospital. Arafiles and his wife purchased a house in Kermit, and they were ready to stay there for him to work at the hospital long term. As Arafiles moved to Kermit, he was very quickly accepted and liked by those in the community. He headed out to the social events, he would play golf, for example, and even in the hospital, colleagues seemed to enjoy having him around. He brought good energy to patients, and this was a common thing that people have described about him. The number one adjective I've seen while researching this case is that he was charismatic. He was well liked by most people, and it seemed like he was going to fit in just fine at the hospital. But while things seemed like they were perfect, there was actually one problem regarding Dr. Arafiles' practice. Because during the time of his hiring at Winkler Memorial, he in fact had a restriction on his medical license. That previous year, on April 13th, 2007, Dr. Arafiles had a sanction or restriction placed on his license by the Texas Medical Board, or the TMB, also known as the board. This sanction was placed on him because it was alleged that, quote, Dr. Arafiles had failed to adequately supervise a physician assistant at a weight loss clinic where he worked, and because he failed to make an independent medical professional decision about the protocol developed by the clinic's owner. Sometime around 2003 to 2004, Dr. Arafiles was contracted to start working at a weight loss clinic in Victoria, Texas. There was the owner of the clinic, a physician assistant, and Dr. Arafiles, amongst other staff. Dr. Arafiles' job was to supervise the physician assistant, but there were some major problems with the operations at this clinic. Specifically, they were using a medication called phentermine to treat obesity in patients who weren't even obese per BMI standards, which is 30 and above, or in some cases 27 and above if somebody has a weight-related condition. Likewise, they were using diuretics to treat patients with hypertension as a potential side effect of the phentermine, even if the patient didn't have hypertension or edema. He signed off on these treatments for months, but eventually he felt concerned on how much the patients were depending on the medications as opposed to lifestyle changes, and so he convinced the owner they should change up the protocol. But it wasn't just that he was signing off on questionable medical practices, but the TMB discovered that during his time working at the clinic, Dr. Arafiles spent less than 5% of his time supervising the physician assistant, and instead spent the majority of the time reviewing the physician assistant's files. It was because of this, the board ordered Dr. Arafiles to pay an administrative penalty of $1,000, and he was also ordered to complete 20 hours of continuing medical education courses each year regarding the areas of ethics, medical records, and treatment of obesity. And additionally, the TMB also ended up restricting Dr. Arafiles from doing a few different things he as a physician normally would be able to do. He was restricted from being able to supervise physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and surgical assistants. And he was even restricted from being able to give nurse practitioners or physician assistants prescriptive authority, which is the authority to prescribe medications. Just a note, currently in 27 states plus Washington, D.C., nurse practitioners are allowed to prescribe medications independently without the supervision of a physician. This means they have full practice authority. Texas, on the other hand, currently and also during this time of the case, is one of the 12 states that have restricted practice authority, meaning that for them to write prescriptions, they have to be delegated prescriptive authority by a physician through a prescriptive authority agreement. The same rule goes for physician assistants, but in every state. But with Dr. Arafiles being restricted from giving prescriptive authority, this meant that whenever he saw patients going forward, he wasn't allowed to just send them off to the nurse practitioner or physician assistant under his supervision. He instead had to see every single patient who came in and do things that he'd normally delegate for the nurse practitioner or physician assistant to do. This order was to be in place for 3 years. So while Wiley was trying to hire him, Dr. Arafiles was still under these restrictions, and he still had 2 years to go before the restrictions were gone. The thing is, with the conditions of this sanction, he only was required to fully follow the rules for 12 months. After those 12 months were up, which they were by that point, if he wanted these restrictions removed from his license, he would have to write the board to petition to remove them, and then they would decide if they would or not. Wiley really wanted to hire Dr. Arafiles, so he informed the hospital's board about the restrictions and recommended that the board still should hire him, which is exactly what happened because despite the restrictions, Dr. Arafiles was in fact hired and he went on to work as the second current physician at the hospital at the time. Not just this, but in addition to clinical practice, that next year in 2009, he also worked as the local health authority or health officer for Winkler County. Just a few months after Dr. Arafiles was hired, Winkler Memorial was able to find a third physician when Wiley recruited Dr. Kenneth Winton. But while one might have hoped that having these new physicians would be helpful in getting the hospital running a bit more smoothly, it didn't take long for some staff members to already begin taking notice of some concerns they had regarding Dr. Arafiles. As part of her regular duties, Nurse Ann checked the credentials of Dr. Arafiles, and while checking, it was then when she learned that he had this restriction on his license for 3 years. This was concerning simply because of the fact that when he was hired, he was one of 2 of the only physicians at the hospital. And based on the bylaws of the hospital, a physician with a restricted license was not allowed to be on the active medical staff. So before Dr. Winton was hired, the only person who would have been able to supervise Naomi Warren, the nurse practitioner, was Dr. Pham, meaning if Dr. Pham ever went on vacation or was away, Naomi wouldn't have been able to treat patients. As part of both Nurse Ann and Nurse Vickilyn's job, they were both required to review records from the emergency department to check for compliance with the standard of care. Some cases were routed for Nurse Ann to review, and other cases were routed for Nurse Vickilyn to review. Now, for new doctors hired at the hospital, before they're allowed to have full active medical privileges, they need to do a 6-month provisional or probationary period. So Dr. Arafiles was hired in April, so this meant his probationary period would be up in October. Now, several of the cases regarding the patients Dr. Arafiles saw in the ER during his 6-month provisional period were in fact routed to Nurse Ann. And it was when the nurses looked through these cases when they noticed very odd things coming from Dr. Arafiles' care. Specifically, while Nurse Vickilyn was just doing her normal checks, she couldn't help but notice a recurring problem where Dr. Arafiles would diagnose and admit a patient to the hospital despite the diagnosis not meeting the appropriate criteria and medical documentation. She actually hopped into action very quickly about these cases by directly speaking to Dr. Arafiles. Whenever this would happen, Nurse Vickilyn would make sure to take steps to obtain the necessary documentation, which included her directly requesting it from Dr. Arafiles. And if she wasn't able to obtain the documentation necessary to support the diagnosis, she would then have to request that the patient be downgraded to a 24-hour observation, meaning they would be observed for 24 hours before it's decided if they would be admitted or discharged. So Dr. Arafiles already started off not following the correct guidelines of the hospital, and this was something that not only the 2 nurses observed, but nurse practitioner Naomi also noticed as well. Naomi described from the following, quote, "From almost the beginning, though, it was clear that his care was questionable. He isolated himself, he had his own nurse, he gave care in the back of the clinic, so it was not obvious to all of us what kind of care he was giving." And it wasn't only this secretiveness that was odd, because Naomi soon started noticing direct actions coming from Dr. Arafiles that were prohibited by the bylaws and the rules of the hospital. There were patients at the hospital who for years were on regular medications to treat health issues or to keep their health stable. Specifically, there were patients who for several years were on thyroid medications at the hospital, and these patients were stable and doing just fine with the treatment plan they had already been doing. Now, by July that year, only about 2 months into Dr. Arafiles working at the hospital, Naomi couldn't help but notice that these patients who had been on these medications regularly and were doing just fine suddenly had their treatment plan changed up. Dr. Arafiles, for some reason, began changing these medications that these patients were taking. And what was especially odd is that he wasn't following up with these patients to see how they were doing with the new medications. Not just this, but even with patients who had come into the hospital with a common sickness like stomach issues or a sinus infection, Naomi discovered that Dr. Arafiles began prescribing these patients with thyroid stimulating drugs, which in the name are medications intended to stimulate the release of thyroid hormones in the body. Under certain circumstances, for example, if somebody has an underactive thyroid, it's very reasonable for a doctor to prescribe said person with a medication like this. In this case, however, these weren't patients who didn't necessarily have thyroid issues. They didn't need to be taking these medications. In a healthy patient, taking thyroid-stimulating drugs could lead to hyperthyroidism, which is when one produces too much thyroid hormones. And hyperthyroidism, left unchecked and untreated, can lead to a plethora of health issues, one of the most notable issues being irregular heartbeat. Naomi was concerned about this, so she brought these worries up to Dr. Arafiles, and he ended up replying with his explanation on the reasoning behind his treatment plan. She stated the following quote, "He explained to me at length that the thyroid numbers in a lab aren't important. That's not what you look for. You look for obesity, extra fat behind the arm, fatigue, and that's all you need to know." Naomi had never heard of anything like that regarding these medications. She even tried searching through sources to find evidence to back it up, but even through her search, she couldn't find anything supporting this theory, so she told him this. And Dr. Arafiles replied like, "Oh, really? Guess what? I have the sources showing this." He brought over 2 paperback books to Naomi and was like, "Look, these are the sources that share information regarding the thyroid medications." And as Naomi looked at the books, she was a bit caught off guard because the books weren't ones containing scientific literature, but instead were ones she stated were, quote, obviously alternative medicine. Further describing, quote, "The author was a person, I'm not sure if he was a doctor, but he had studied corpses and had determined that these symptoms showed the need for thyroid." Now, it wasn't just the nurses or the nurse practitioner who took notice of some of the questionable things Dr. Arafiles was doing, because not long went by when patients themselves began noticing some things that were off regarding Dr. Arafiles' practice, and soon enough, complaints were actually being made regarding him. Something that's a very important note is that Dr. Arafiles wasn't just a practicing physician, but he was also the owner of a company called Health to Fit, where he offered health and social care services, specifically with alternative medicine treatments. For many years, working at these different hospitals, he would also be running his business or businesses on the side. According to a post on his Facebook page from June 4th, 2009, Dr. Arafiles described some of these services he offered, stating, quote, "I practice family medicine with special interest in Ayurveda, Let me look up how to pronounce that.
Homeopathy.
Isn't that what I said? I said that. I practice family medicine with special interest in Ayurveda, homeopathy, and holistic medicine. My practice accentuates and covers nutrition and nutritional supplementation, lifestyle counseling, fitness, and enhancement of well-being through bioidentical hormone balancing to the prescription of pharmaceutical drugs." On the Wayback Machine, his old website, healthtofit.net, features different posts regarding all types of treatments he was selling, such as Alkavita Silver and swine gel. It also talks about swine flu and alternatives for the H1N1 vaccine. It talks about treatment for Morgellons, which is a scientifically unsubstantiated skin condition, and it talks about alkaline water as well. Furthermore, one section on his site states that silver can address the following health issues, including things like cancer, herpes, diabetes, leukemia, lupus, and tuberculosis, amongst many others. At the top of the page features a picture of him with his name Rolando Arafiles, MD, under, and at the bottom of the page there's a disclaimer stating, quote, "All material herein is provided for information only and may not be construed as personal medical advice. The FDA has not evaluated these statements. None of the information or products discussed on this site are intended to diagnose, treat, mitigate, or cure any disease." On his Facebook page, there's also a picture of an alkalizer machine and the description, quote, "Alkalizer is a machine which produces a gallon per minute of special water that will assist with your body in cleansing impurities and healing ailments." And when asked by somebody in the comments on how long he's been dealing with the product, he said he's been, quote, "dealing this for not less than 9 years already." So definitely sometime since around 2000, he had been doing this. According to Saul Elbine from the Texas Observer, at some point in the early 2000s while working at a hospital, Dr. Arafiles ran a holistic care clinic where he provided a service called chelation therapy, which is a treatment healthcare providers use to remove heavy metals from one's blood. Dr. Arafiles, however, at this clinic was not using it for this purpose. He was using it as a treatment remedy to detoxify one's blood from various health conditions not related to heavy metals in the blood. This is something the FDA has actually warned against doing, as there's no evidence that chelators can detoxify the body. The only thing the FDA and researchers say chelators are useful for are the removal of heavy metals from things like metal poisoning, for example. A few clients treated at this chelation clinic stated that they remembered Dr. Arafiles as a person who was about his money, essentially. Richard Monk, a client who saw Dr. Arafiles in 2002 for chelation therapy to treat arsenic poisoning, stated, quote, "Everything he did was about making a profit. He was constantly double billing. He would charge patients by the half hour and then keep them waiting half an hour and then charge for that." And another client, Alan Dennis, described suffering a stroke after being given 10 times the normal amount of heparin, which is a blood thinner used during chelation therapy, by Dr. Arafiles. This patient was getting the treatment for clogged arteries, and they'd done it 50 times in the past elsewhere and felt good from it. But after doing it with Dr. Arafiles, they'd suffered multiple strokes afterwards and had debilitating side effects such as burning eyes and fatigue. The client's wife, Hope, described never liking Dr. Arafiles to the point she stopped going to the sessions with her husband before the stroke happened. Very quickly into his appointment at Winkler Memorial, Nurse Warren began noticing that patients were leaving with, quote, little bottles of various solutions or samples of drinks. And she would further explain, quote, "Many patients told me they had been given samples of solutions to drink that he said would cure many ailments." Of these patients included somebody named Judy, a patient with a chronic health issue who was seen by Dr. Arafiles at the hospital. Judy had written a patient review about Dr. Arafiles on vitals.com, an online database where patients are able to review their healthcare providers. In this review, Judy claimed that Dr. Arafiles offered her a magic pill to treat the chronic health issue, writing, quote, "I asked if I could read up on it in any pamphlets or studies, and he said it's new, so there isn't any studies or pamphlets that show it actually works." Further writing that after she requested to order the magic pill over the phone, quote, he says, "Oh no, you can't get it at local stores, but for $78.99, you can have a 2-month starter pack to try it out, and then it will be time for your next appointment with me." I'm not sure when that comment was written, but that's what the review stated. Not just this, but Nurse Ann took notice that Dr. Arafiles was apparently sending out emails to patients he would see in the clinic and try encouraging them to purchase these herbal medications from him. And if you were wondering what the magic pill or the supplements he was giving were, well, he was giving out a supplement called Zri. Zri Inc., founded in 2007, is a company which sells an herbal supplemental drink through a multi-level marketing or MLM model. The main ingredient in its drink is grape juice concentrate, but it contains a bunch of other herbs. At the time of the case, it was selling for about $40 for a bottle. Now it's selling for about $70 to $82 on its website and on Amazon. As mentioned, Dr. Arafiles was not just selling these supplements as his own thing on the side, which he would be allowed to do as his own business. The problem was he was recommending and selling these supplements to patients he was treating at the hospital. And this was something he'd actually done before at the previous medical clinics he would work at. Just by September 2008, so 5 months into Dr. Arafiles working at Winkler Memorial, the nurses had received several reports regarding Dr. Arafiles' treatment of patients, because it wasn't that he was not only just not following the proper standard of care, but he was also doing things to patients that he was not permitted to do. In particular, there were 3 instances where Dr. Arafiles, who was a family medicine physician and not a surgeon, was performing surgeries on patients, which is something that he was not allowed or credentialed to do. In the first instance, on about September 22nd, there was a 73-year-old patient who had diabetes and presented to the emergency room with a gash on his hand that required a full-thickness skin graft. With the complexity of a procedure like this, as mentioned, patients would likely be sent over to a bigger hospital in Odessa. In this case, however, despite not being authorized to do so, Dr. Arafiles removed skin from the patient's abdomen and performed a skin graft onto the injured area of their hand himself. But what makes this so much worse is that the patient went home after getting this skin graft done. And when they returned just that next week, a nurse who worked under Dr. Arafiles saw that the skin graft had failed, stating, quote, "There was no blood supply. It was black like charcoal." During the follow-up appointment, the patient told Dr. Arafiles that the skin graft was black and looked horrible to the patient. But despite the patient's concerns, Dr. Arafiles told the patient that he thinks the skin graft looks great. So this patient left the hospital after this appointment, and they quickly returned the next day to voice their concerns. This time, they saw Dr. Pham, and Dr. Pham knew he was looking at his failed skin graft. So he ended up sending the patient to a plastic surgeon in Odessa, Texas, so that the surgeon could fix whatever Dr. Arafiles did to him. In the next instance, just one day after this, on the 23rd, there was a patient who had a compound fracture on their thumb, and according to the board, Dr. Arafiles, quote, "sutured part of a rubber tip removed from suture kit scissors to the wound on the patient's right thumb." And in the third instance, there was a person who injured their toe after accidentally dropping a frozen turkey on their foot. And Dr. Arafiles stabilized this patient's toe by inserting a needle into the bone. In addition to doing these unpermitted surgeries, there were also two other cases that were eventually cited regarding Dr. Arafiles' care. One of these times was on September 9th, when there was a patient who had an abscess from an MRSA infection, and he treated their abscess by rubbing oxygenated olive oil on it, despite this not being FDA approved or listed on the hospital's formulary. And just the next month, on October 9th, there was a child who had lower quadrant abdomen pain and pre-existing history of nausea and vomiting. But Dr. Arafiles didn't do a proper history or physical on them and sent home the child with appendicitis after failing to diagnose them. This would also happen later on, but the next year in 2009, there would also be a patient who developed deep vein thrombosis, also known as blood clot, after Dr. Arafiles failed to properly assess them. This person was at high risk for deep vein thrombosis, and Dr. Arafiles gave the patient HRT, despite this being contraindicated for those who are high risk for deep vein thrombosis. Likewise, in later reports, they would eventually find that he did unnecessary genitourinary exams on 4 of these cited patients out of the 9 patient list. Kind of the same with the change of thyroid medications, Dr. Arafiles wouldn't follow up with patients regarding most things that they did. It would be the nurses who would notice that the patients didn't react well to something, and they would be the ones who need to make sure that it got rectified somehow. Debbie Eggers, a clinical nurse who sometimes worked with Dr. Arafiles, stated the following quote, "He didn't even open up his chart to clarify age or the patient's name. He never looked at anything. He told me that he was glad I worked on his side because I was his eyes, because he never looked at anything. He only signed his name. That's word for word." After discovering the things Dr. Arafiles was doing in the emergency department, that same month in September 2008, nurses Ann and Vickilyn and nurse practitioner Naomi individually went to the hospital administrator, Stan Wiley, to inform him on what was going on and express the concerns they had. Naomi specifically discussed the supplements that Dr. Arafiles was giving out. And when telling this to Wiley, she didn't want Dr. Arafiles to be fired or anything. She genuinely just wanted him to follow the rules of the hospital and the correct standard of care. And she assumed from the perspective of the hospital administrator, Wiley too would want something like this to happen so that they could avoid any liability issues. She stated, quote, "I told him that Arafiles was giving off-label, non-FDA approved medicine and that he was going to hurt people. I said, at least if you're going to let him do this, you might as well have the patient sign a waiver so they know what they're getting." Even though she wasn't actually serious about the waiver and mentioned it as she was, quote, trying to get him to realize how ridiculous it was, Wiley actually loved the idea of the waiver, and he asked her if she would be able to draft one up for Dr. Arafiles. Nurse Ann, on the other hand, specifically discussed the reports she saw regarding Dr. Arafiles' treatment. So he too asked her to send an email to him telling him the policies of the hospital. In this email, she wrote the following quote, "Medications used by physicians and allied healthcare must have been approved by the regulating agency, i.e. FDA, and have the necessary documentation indicating dose benefits, possible adverse effects, drug interactions, etc. While the nurses and Naomi were genuinely concerned about the well-being of the patients, Wiley had a whole other concern to be worried about because the hospital's insurance didn't cover any surgical procedures. Wiley knew that he was doing these procedures and that this would present a risk and liability issues. And he was very concerned by this. So because of this, Wiley told Nurse Ann, like, hey, could you make sure to pull the patient records and also meet with the assistant director of nursing to determine and discuss what happened? I'm not sure what happened at this particular meeting. However, what is known is that on September 30th, Wiley ended up sending out an email to Doctors Arafiles, Pham, and Winton, reminding them that they could not perform any surgical procedures at the hospital, whether it be at the emergency department, the clinic, or even a patient's home. They were not allowed to perform any surgical procedures. By the way, the reason Wiley even mentioned home visits in this email was because Dr. Arafiles had previously expressed being willing to do home visits. Not only was this email sent out, but just about a week later on October 8th, the medical staff at the hospital had a meeting. This meeting included Wiley, Nurse Ann, Nurse Vickilyn, Nurse Practitioner Naomi, and Doctors Pham, Arafiles, and Winton. Part of Nurse Vickilyn's responsibilities were also to review the cases of people staying inpatient, and she was also responsible for sending medical records out for peer review through a program in Texas called the Texas A&M Rural and Community Health Institute, or RCHI program. The purpose of these peer review programs are to have a committee review care in the hospital, whether it be through looking at patient charts, medical notes, billing, etc., in order to, quote, improve patient safety and the quality of care. Usually at these meetings, nurses Ann and Vickilyn would typically discuss write-ups based on their review of the patient charts, and Nurse Vickilyn would also usually discuss the files submitted for peer review. But while this is what they usually discuss, it was at this particular meeting where the group instead discussed what Wiley had mentioned in the email, which is to not perform any surgical procedures at home, at the clinic, or at the emergency department. While they discussed why it was wrong to do surgeries there, Nurse Vickilyn was like, you know what? This would also be the perfect time to address my concerns of Dr. Arafiles not following the proper standard of care. So she began speaking and she was like, hey, you know what? There's something else I'm concerned about. Dr. Arafiles, there seems to be some issues with standard of care. She brought up the cases where Dr. Arafiles performed surgical procedures, including the failed skin graft or the rubber suturing. And as she was stating these examples, Dr. Arafiles sat there with Wiley right beside him with his arm over Dr. Arafiles' shoulder. And in response, he was like, oh, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to do those things. But as she tried to continue saying what she was going to say, it was at that point Wiley was like, Nurse Vickilyn, that's okay. We won't talk about that right now. We'll get back to these complaints once the board has more information. After cutting Nurse Vickilyn off and telling her that they will discuss it later, Wiley then patted Dr. Arafiles on the back and told him, quote, that's okay, big guy, that's okay. Now, after the meeting wrapped up and everybody left, Wiley immediately called Nurse Vickilyn into his office, and once she came in, he told her, like, hey, make sure you don't send any of the medical records to RCHI for peer review. There will be no discussion on that decision. I'll let you know when you can resume doing that, but for now, don't send it in, and that's final. As mentioned, sending in files for peer review was part of Nurse Vickilyn's job, as it helped ensure patients were being treated correctly. She wanted to send in files for peer review, but Wiley was telling her to not do this anymore, and he made it clear that there would be no discussion on the decision. This pattern of Wiley not listening to the nurse's suggestion was something they described as normal for him. Nurse Ann stated, quote, he didn't want us looking at anything or making comments about anything. He was the administrator, and that was how it was. There was one big problem with Nurse Vickilyn not sending in the medical records though, because prior to the meeting they had, Nurse Vickilyn had already left the files at the medical records department. and the files were well into the mail by the time they were speaking at the meeting. Nurse Vickilyn was extremely worried about this. She was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose my job if I don't get these files. So to fix this, she picked up the phone and quickly called the RCHI. And once somebody answered, she was like, hey, I'm a registered nurse at the Winkler County Memorial Hospital. I'm in charge of sending in the medical files. There's a bit of an issue. I'm requesting that you guys shred the files once you receive them. I'm unsure whether they did shred the files or not, but Nurse Vickilyn didn't end up getting fired, so I can only assume that that situation got rectified somehow. Because they weren't able to fully discuss everything at the meeting, Dr. Pham decided to set up another meeting to happen the following week so they could discuss the standard of care then, particularly regarding the unpermitted procedures Dr. Arafiles was doing in the emergency room. Specifically, Dr. Pham was concerned about the treatment Dr. Arafiles had towards patients with the thyroid medications, and he was also concerned about the case of the patient with diabetes who had received the failed skin graft. This meeting was supposed to be with Drs. Pham, Arafiles, and Winton, Nurse Ann, and Wiley. I'm not sure why, but Nurse Vickilyn wasn't invited to attend. But while the staff had very important things they needed to discuss at the meeting, for some reason, Wiley ended up canceling the meeting, and he later explained that he did that because he met with Dr. Arafiles after the meeting they had on October 8th when he had requested that Dr. Arafiles leave the hospital. But apparently Dr. Arafiles wasn't happy with this request, and he apparently told Wiley that he was going to be getting a lawyer. Now, Dr. Pham would later tell Wiley that it was completely inappropriate for him to cancel the meeting. But I guess Wiley was just concerned about the legal repercussions, because it wasn't too long after when Wiley consulted with the hospital's attorney, who also happened to be the Winkler County attorney, Scott Tidwell. And it was during this meeting where he informed Tidwell about the problems that were discussed at the October 8th meeting with the medical staff. Just some background on him. Scott Tidwell himself had only recently moved to Kermit that year in 2008. And this was a move he made not too long after already having a big scandal attached to him. Tidwell was the owner of his own law firm called the Tidwell Law Firm in Odessa, Texas. But he soon got into some heat because a few years prior to him moving, he was charged and convicted for being involved in a prostitution ring from 2003 known as the Healing Touch scandal. This case involved a massage parlor that Tidwell was a client of. And according to sources, he was throwing parties with prostitutes from this ring with clients at his firm. Additionally, he was paying prostitutes for services for himself, ranging $2,000 to $4,000 a visit. All the while, he had a wife and was married. And that's just the tea. That is really just the tea. That's crazy. 61 people were arrested, and the case became so big, a fictional Lifetime movie called The Client List was even created in 2010 covering it. All in all, even though he denied paying to sleep with the women, in 2004, he pled guilty to one count of prostitution, which resulted in a $1,300 fine. And it was several years after this scandal when he left Odessa, Texas to move to Kermit and run for county attorney there in 2008. Now, Dr. Pham had an idea which he hoped to discuss at the next medical staff meeting. As mentioned, Dr. Arafiles had a restriction on his license at the time and still had a little over a year of these restrictions. If you remember, he would be allowed to get these restrictions removed as long as he writes the Texas Medical Board and gets approved for their removal. He didn't do this though, so based on the bylaws of the hospital, this meant he was not allowed to have full active medical privileges. With Dr. Arafiles' 6-month probationary period coming to an end, the only way he would be allowed to have these privileges is if he got the restrictions removed from the board and if the medical staff at the hospital could collectively agree that he should even have these privileges. Dr. Pham expressed to Wiley that he did not want Dr. Arafiles to have full medical privileges at the hospital yet because he was concerned about the procedures that he was doing in the emergency department. He thought it would be a good idea to take a vote with the medical staff on if Dr. Arafiles should be given full medical privileges or not. So, after canceling the 2 meetings in October, Wiley rescheduled a regular medical staff meeting on November 12th to discuss both the concerns they had and also discuss the vote on whether Dr. Arafiles should get his medical privileges or not at the hospital. But like he did before, he again canceled the staff meeting to instead have it on November 26th. And instead of finally having the meeting on the 26th, he again canceled it to push it back to December. So Wiley kept holding off on a meeting that was very important time-wise when there was literal patients being still seen and treated at the hospital. It was finally in December, a whole 2 months later, when they were able to have this meeting. And the whole topic of the meeting was to determine whether Dr. Arafiles and also whether Dr. Winton would be given full medical privileges or not. By the way, I'm not sure exactly why they were trying to figure out if Dr. Winton should be given full medical privileges. I could only assume it was because he was new, so he was also finishing up his probationary period, because I couldn't find anything else regarding him. Prior to this meeting, Dr. Pham told Wiley that he preferred to give Dr. Winton full medical privileges first, and then wait a few months so that he and Dr. Winton together could decide whether Dr. Arafiles should be given full medical privileges or if he shouldn't be given them. But while this seemed like a reasonable recommendation to Dr. Pham, Wiley didn't like this idea whatsoever. He did not agree, and he told Dr. Pham, look, I don't like that idea. We're not doing that. Just a reminder, by the way, Dr. Pham is the literal chief of staff of the hospital. A chief of staff is responsible for the medical supervision or regulation of the hospital. But even as the chief of staff of the hospital, Dr. Pham clearly was not able to do any kind of regulation simply because Wiley couldn't seem to agree with any of the suggestions Dr. Pham had to operate an effective and safe medical facility. Dr. Pham straight up told Wiley, look, you know what? You're preventing me from performing my duties as the chief of staff. I don't want to work at this hospital anymore. And you want to know what Wiley said? He was like, you know what? I understand. I'm willing to release you from your contract so you don't have to work here anymore. But I will only do that under one condition. I will release you from your contract with the hospital as long as you vote to give Dr. Arafiles full active medical privileges. Dr. Pham did not like that idea. As chief of staff, he had responsibility to make sure things were being operated at a standard level, and what he saw Dr. Arafiles doing was not standard whatsoever. But seeing the people he was up against, it was genuinely looking like he wouldn't have been able to do much at that point, and that was not an environment he wanted to stay in. So Dr. Pham reluctantly agreed and voted to give Dr. Arafiles full medical privileges. As mentioned, with doing this, he was supposed to be released from his contract. But despite being told this would happen by Wiley, the hospital's board of control actually refused to release Dr. Pham from his contract. So he still had to stay at the hospital until his contract was officially up. Now, as part of giving Dr. Arafiles full privileges, they agreed that he must contact the Texas Medical Board to remove the restrictions he had on his license. And they gave him 6 months to get this completed by June 9th, 2009. In addition to the medical staff meeting, they also had a meeting with the hospital's Board of Control that month in December 2008. They expressed the same concerns regarding the standard of care. Dr. Pham even pulled up case reports and documentation. But according to Ann, Bill Beckham, the president of the hospital's Board of Control, responded to her saying, quote, everyone in the community liked Arafiles, and the only problem he was hearing from anyone were coming from me. It was even later speculated at the time that Wiley allegedly attempted to get Nurse Ann removed from the hospital by trying to get her boss at her other workplace as the emergency management coordinator to give her full-time hours. Yeah, interesting plan. This is alleged. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if the man did it though, because the way he was acting in this case, child. This, however, didn't work as her boss declined, which is interesting because remember how Dr. Arafiles worked at a Crane hospital for less than 3 months? Well, the Crane hospital administrator at the time, Bill Barnes, went on to describe how when Dr. Arafiles was at Crane for just those 3 little months, he got very close to the county judge, Donnie Henderson. They became good friends. They would hang out, do golf, what have you. But with this, if there was ever a dispute, Henderson would take Dr. Arafiles' side. Bill Barnes described how there was even a point Dr. Arafiles wanted him fired, but it was around that time when Dr. Arafiles just quit working at the hospital, so this didn't end up happening. And Barnes further described that the reason the hospital didn't mind letting go of Dr. Arafiles was because apparently he had actually lied about having malpractice insurance, and this would have been a liability for the hospital. And when Saul Elbine from the Texas Observer asked why they didn't didn't report this to the board. Bill Barnes explained it was just difficult with a lack of evidence and no compliance officer who worked at the hospital. At this meeting in December, Dr. Arafiles actually asked the hospital board if he could be given supplies to do a procedure in a patient's home. And Dr. Pham had to step in like, no, you're not doing that. But this wasn't all, because Wiley mentioned something at the meeting that honestly just made everything else that was already going on worse. Because despite it being required by the Bureau of Nurse Examiners for nurses to report any activity where patients may be harmed, Wiley implemented a new policy prohibiting staff from reporting doctors without his permission first. He instructed the staff that going forward, they should not send any chart review or reports to a compliance entity without first going through medical staff, administration, and the Board of Control at the hospital. And very soon, the hospital's Board of Control changed their policies to put this rule in effect. In January 2009, the hospital's Board of Control held a meeting again, but this time for members of the public and various officials to attend, including people like Attorney Tidwell, for example. At this meeting, the nurses and Dr. Pham not only brought up the same issues, but Dr. Pham also addressed the conflict he was having with Wiley and the conflicts between the doctors regarding patient care. Likewise, nurse practitioner Naomi brought up the policy change from the previous month and requested that the hospital's Board of Control do something to ensure they restore the mechanisms they used to have that allowed efficient and unbiased review of records. But they didn't get much resolution from this meeting because the Board of Control simply responded by instructing that Tidwell should find someone who would be able to mediate the doctors' problems with one another. That was all. That was the conclusion of this meeting. No changes to the policy whatsoever. And you know what was interesting? Despite the issues being brought up being ones that were mainly affecting or regarding Dr. Arafiles, he and even Dr. Winton weren't even there at the meeting to hear any of this. After this meeting, all the hospital staff ended up receiving an email, and when they checked, they saw that the email was from Wiley. In this email, Wiley appeared to have a change of heart and was actually responding to the issues that were raised at the hospital board meeting, because he ended up apologizing to the staff for canceling the meeting they were supposed to have on October 16th like 3 times. And in this email, he also requested that they, quote, reactivate any and every patient care action that you may have stopped. So while this was great and seemed like Wiley was trying to step forward in a good direction, it was not even a few sentences later when he went on to inform the staff that moving forward, only doctors would be the ones who will be attending the medical staff meetings. Going forward, there were going to be no nurses there whatsoever. And just like that, they were already taking a few steps backward. It wasn't too long after this meeting and email in February of 2009 when nurse practitioner Naomi actually ended up quitting, stating, quote, they beat me down. I realized they were on a path they didn't intend to get off of. Which, by the way, according to another board member, when this happened, the president of the board responded by saying, quote, well, if she doesn't like Arafiles, let her go. The suggestions the nurses had were not being taken into consideration. In fact, almost the opposite of what they were suggesting to happen in the hospital was happening. Sometime in late February or early March, the hospital ended up developing a new process for external peer review. But with this new process, they implemented a rule that before any files could be sent to RCHI for peer review, doctors would be allowed to vote whether the selected files should be sent or not. So it didn't matter what the reason was. This new process gave doctors a bias to send in files whether they wanted to or not. Nurse Vickilyn actually selected a total of 6 files consisting of 2 files from each doctor to be left for their review. Dr. Pham voted for all 6 of the files that Nurse Vickilyn selected to be sent in for peer review. But Dr. Winton voted against every single one of the files being sent in for peer review. Not only this, but Dr. Arafiles didn't even vote. Instead, he just went straight up to Wiley's office and complained about this. So what did Wiley do? Wiley then removed all of the files and told Nurse Vickilyn that she could not send any of the files to RCHI. After Naomi left, there were some significant changes in the hospital. Naomi began working at the Monahans Hospital about 25 miles or 40 kilometers east, and over 600 of her patients also left Winkler Memorial to travel to see her for treatment. Likewise, staff such as the clinical nurse, Debbie Eggers, and even Corina Chavez, the clinic manager, they quit Winkler Memorial to work alongside Naomi in Monaghan's. Eggers stated, quote, "I couldn't control Dr. Arafiles, and I couldn't sleep at night wondering what if I didn't catch one of his mistakes." While Nurse Ann and Nurse Vickilyn stayed at the hospital, they were not satisfied whatsoever with the resolution the hospital had for any of the issues they presented. They tried for months, weeks. They tried for such a long time to get a resolution. They went to the hospital administrator. They went to the doctor himself. They went to the hospital's board of control. They went to every single person in the hospital that they could have possibly went to make changes that were for patient care and for patient safety. And none of their suggestions were listened to. At that point, they couldn't go to anyone else at the hospital because every higher up at the hospital were saying, no, like, we're just going to continue doing what we're doing already. They had to think of what to do next. So soon enough, the nurses went on to have conversations with each other and with nurse practitioner Naomi on whether they should file a complaint with the Texas Medical Board. It was after multiple discussions they had with one another when they finally decided that they will in fact file a complaint with the TMB. They worked together on this complaint. Nurse Vickilyn provided some of the information, and then Nurse Ann drafted and typed it. Some of the complaint read the following, quote, "As a patient advocate and registered nurse, it is my duty and responsibility to express my concerns regarding the standard of care that this physician provides to the community. Patients that are seen in the clinic by Dr. Arafiles are later emailed and encouraged to buy herbal medicines that he sells. These medicines are not sold in the clinic. The pharmacy has kept a log of intervention necessary due to dosage issues, i.e. vancomycin dosage in children, and MVI usage. Herbal medications are not in the formulary. Concerns have been voiced by 2 other physicians, ED staff, and clinic staff. The administrator and board of control have been notified of these concerns. At the appropriate time, I will speak with an investigator should the medical board determine that an investigation is warranted." In this complaint, the nurses informed the TMB about all the new policies implemented at the hospital, including self-review and the prohibition of reporting concerns to a relevant board without first going through the hospital. They included the file numbers of 6 cases in which patients were not treated with the proper standard of care. They mentioned that Dr. Arafiles had been given active medical staff privileges, despite that being against the hospital's rules due to the restricted license. And they also mentioned that there had been physicians and staff trying to address the concerns internally, but they were shut down each time by the hospital's administrator. Nurse practitioner Naomi also prepared a complaint herself, including information of additional patients she witnessed who were harmed. She described how she had worked at the hospital for 13 years, but all it took was working with Dr. Arafiles at the Winkler County Rural Health Clinic for less than 1 year from May 2008 through February 2009. To resign from this position. Her report contained details of 5 patient cases which concerned her. These included cases where Dr. Arafiles prescribed Armour thyroid for 3 patients but failed to order appropriate baseline lab work on them. He didn't order any lab work in the entire 6 months when he treated a patient with type 1 diabetes, and where he refused to see a patient with an earache until they completed lab work, and then failed to notify the patient of the lab results or even check their ear. Naomi also mentioned the herbal supplements that he was giving and selling to patients. Specifically, in this letter, she reported that Dr. Arafiles was a distributor of an herbal drink, and she stated that he would bring these drinks to the clinic where he would give samples to his patients or would encourage them to either go to his website or directly call his wife so that they could purchase the herbal drink. And she stated that he would tell the patients that the drinks were beneficial for things like fever, heart disease, arthritis, and any other ailment. Now, in the letter typed by Nurse Ann, she described herself as a female over 50 years of age who's worked at the hospital since the 1980s, but she didn't sign her name off on it. Her and Nurse Vickilyn decided to submit the letter anonymously as they were concerned that this would, quote, certainly create an opportunity for Mr. Wiley to remove me from employment. Naomi, however, didn't sign off her letter anonymously, which makes sense because she wasn't working at the hospital anymore. So when they were all done writing, Nurse Ann collected both the anonymous complaint written by her and Nurse Vickilyn alongside the complaint written by Naomi, and she mailed the letters in the same envelope off to the TMB. Nurse Ann was so nervous about this, she actually mailed the letter from Odessa so it didn't appear to come from Kermit where they were. This anonymous complaint was sent on April 7th and filed at the TMB on April 13th. And fortunately, the TMB started working in a timely manner because it was just a couple days later on the 15th when Dr. Arafiles received a letter from the TMB where they let him know that a complaint had been filed against him. The letter described the allegations being made against him, and it advised Dr. Arafiles that the TMB is HIPAA exempt, meaning that patient consent is not legally required to provide the board with protected health information, and thus encouraging and letting Dr. Arafiles know that he can provide any relevant records or documents in his reply, which was due in 14 days on April 29th. Now, Dr. Arafiles seemed to be caught off guard by this letter, and so after reading this, he immediately went up to Wiley to request copies of the patient files who were in question. Not only this, but the TMB also sent the hospital a subpoena for the records. Wiley was quite concerned with the request from the TMB as he thought it, quote, looked very serious. And because of how serious it looked to him, rather than sending the files to the TMB like they requested, Wiley instead instructed Nurse Ann to meet with the county attorney Tidwell to determine what the TMB wanted. Mind you, this wasn't the first time Wiley had responded to requests from the TMB for patient files. He's done that in the past. But this just happened to be the only time he wanted the request to be discussed with the county attorney before complying. Thing is, Nurse Ann did not in fact take these files to discuss with Tidwell, which I'm assuming she rightfully must have refused, especially because she was the one who sent them in. And so because Wiley and Dr. Arafiles seemed to be just so unsettled about receiving the letter, they felt that the complaint that was filed was so bad that it required intervention from the police. And almost 2 weeks after receiving the letter, on April 27th, Dr. Arafiles picked that letter up and brought it straight to the sheriff's office. He brought over a copy of the letter and handed it to the sheriff of Winkler County, Robert L. Roberts, Jr. But Sheriff Roberts wasn't just any sheriff. In fact, he and Dr. Arafiles actually knew each other personally. Dr. Arafiles was not only Robert's physician, but the two were actually business associates with the herbal remedies that Dr. Arafiles was selling, as Roberts worked as a spokesperson for the herbal remedies. Apparently, Dr. Arafiles would have seminars at their local Pizza Hut and Methodist church, signing people up to become distributors of his supplements, specifically Zri. And Roberts would also host these meetings at the Pizza Hut, trying to also convince people to purchase these supplements, kind of going back to that MLM structure of the company. Not only this, but Roberts and Dr. Arafiles seemed to be good friends. They had actually played golf with each other once or twice before, and Sheriff Roberts credited Dr. Arafiles for saving his life after he suffered a heart attack on August 8th, 2008. But that's not all. What's very interesting and very relevant in this case is that remember how there was a hospital board meeting in January 2009 that Dr. Arafiles didn't end up attending? Well, the president of the hospital board actually called Sheriff Roberts around that time, and they were quoted telling Roberts that there was a move to get Dr. Arafiles fired. Sheriff Roberts often attended hospital board meetings and was there for most, if not all, of the ones in which the complaints were made against Dr. Arafiles. And something that is very important to note is that remember how the county attorney Tidwell moved from Odessa after the massage parlor scandal to run for the Winkler County attorney? Well, Sheriff Roberts was actually a big contributing factor in getting this done, as he encouraged Tidwell to do so and even backed up his campaign. It was at that meeting in January when the president of the hospital board actually invited Roberts to speak on Dr. Arafiles' behalf, which Sheriff Roberts did end up doing. So this essentially showed that Dr. Arafiles knew that he had some kind of police backup regarding whatever he did, simply because Roberts was committed to having his back with this move that was out to get him fired. All in all, Sheriff Roberts liked Dr. Arafiles, and it was well known that he thought very highly of him. And you'll see how this partnership of theirs played a tremendous role in the entire situation. When Dr. Arafiles went to the sheriff's department on Monday, he showed Roberts the letter from the TMB, and he told him that he wanted to file a complaint for harassment. After Dr. Arafiles gave Sheriff Roberts a copy of the TMB's letter, which by the way included patient information, he then told the sheriff that the cases that the letter referenced had already been mentioned 3 times. And he said that this complaint made against him now was done as a malicious attempt to damage or ruin his reputation in the medical community. Roberts soon began investigating this case, and he began by personally reaching out to each of the patients who were identified in the TMB's letter, which, by the way, according to the TMB, reaching out to these patients is something that he was not allowed to do. Roberts reached out to these patients. He introduced himself to them, letting it be known that he was conducting an investigation regarding the complaint, and he got to questioning. But he was soon able to determine that none of the patients mentioned in the letter had written it themselves. So after eliminating the patients as the source of the complaint, Sheriff Roberts knew that if it wasn't a patient, that the person who sent it in had to be somebody who had access to the hospital's medical records. And that's when Roberts reached out to Wiley to get more information on staff members who had access. Wiley told Roberts that the list was small, and on April 29, 2009, he escorted Roberts to the records department to take a look at the employees. It was that moment when Wiley then provided Sheriff Roberts with the list of 21 hospital employees of the Winkler County Rural Healthcare Clinic and Hospital who had access to patient health information from April 1, 2008 to the date the letter was filed on April 13, 2009. Sheriff Roberts now had the 21 count list of employees he could narrow down for sending in this letter. And shortly after this, during the first week of May, Sheriff Roberts called the TMB and requested if he could get a copy of the complaint filed against Dr. Arafiles. He initially thought that the TMB would be able to tell him who wrote the letter, but he was surprised to learn that the complaint was anonymous, and he was surprised that the TMB even accepted anonymous complaints. Because of this, Sheriff Roberts knew he wasn't going to get it simply by asking the TMB over the phone. And so he soon wrote a letter to Mary Robinson, the executive director of the TMB, for the complaint letter. On May 8th, Robinson received this letter from Sheriff Roberts, which stated, quote, "Dear Director Robinson, I am conducting a criminal investigation for the offense of misuse of official information and harassment in the case of the complaint filed with the Texas Medical Board regarding Dr. Rolando G. Arafiles. I am requesting a copy of this complaint from the Texas Medical Board to assist with this investigation. I thank you for your cooperation in this matter. Sincerely, Sheriff Robert L. Roberts." Because yes, Roberts was counting the complaint as 2 criminal offenses. Now, after reading this and seeing there was a criminal investigation, the TMB did comply with the request. They sent Roberts a letter with the requested copy of the complaint. And 10 days later, on the 18th, Roberts received this copy. But he didn't just receive only the copy, because in addition, he received a letter from the TMB addressed to him. And after reviewing this letter, he realized there was just one major problem. This letter read, quote, "The board shall cooperate with and assist a law enforcement agency conducting a criminal investigation of a license holder by providing information that is relevant to the criminal investigation to the investigating agency. Information disclosed by the board to an investigative agency remains confidential and may not be disclosed by the investigating agency except as necessary to further the investigation." But then as he read the next sentence, he saw that it said, quote, "It is our understanding that your agency is a bona fide law enforcement agency and is conducting a criminal investigation of a license holder of the TMB. It is also our understanding that your agency is authorized to and agrees to maintain the confidentiality of this information as required by the Texas Occupations Code. If we are incorrect in any of these understandings, please advise us immediately. TMB is not authorized to provide confidential information unless these assumptions are correct. So with this letter, they were essentially stating that to their understanding, Sheriff Roberts was going to be conducting a criminal investigation of a license holder of the TMB. And to their understanding, Sheriff Roberts was going to be agreeing to keep the complaint confidential. Otherwise, they were not authorized to provide the information to him, and he needed to let them know. And this is where the big problem is. A license holder of the TMB is a physician and even a few other medical professionals who are licensed with the state, but not a nurse. In this letter, with the TMB referring to a license holder, they could have likely been referring to Dr. Arafiles for himself, for example, possibly under the assumption that the investigation was being conducted against him, not for him. Roberts was not conducting an investigation of Arafiles or any license holder of the TMB. He was conducting an investigation on whoever sent the letter, meaning based on the letter the TMB sent him, he was not authorized to receive the information, and he should have clarified this to them. But he did not. He did later go on to say that he thought all medical personnel, including nurses, were license holders of the TMB. But regardless, if you're going to be conducting a criminal investigation, that's probably something you should actually confirm beforehand, because they were not license holders. Roberts went on to read the anonymous confidential complaint letter, and he just tried figuring out who wrote it. He initially thought that Dr. Pham was the author of the letter, as Dr. Pham had previously tried calling out Dr. Arafiles' strange practices on multiple occasions. But it was after he got to the bottom of the letter when he was able to determine that that wasn't the case. Because as he read that last part of the letter, he quickly learned that the person who sent in the complaint described themselves as a, quote, over 50-year-old female who's been employed by this facility since the 1980s. With all this new information, Roberts was now able to narrow down exactly who he was looking for, because based on this information, Roberts knew that the only people who fit this description as being female, over 50, and working at the hospital since the 80s were nurses Ann and Vickilyn. And he was ready to start getting some criminal charges filed on them. Ugh. She was this close. All she had to do was not say that she was over 50 and employed since the 80s, girl. Or she should have been allowed to say that. Let's start there. She should have been allowed to say that. She should have been allowed to say her whole name, her whole last name, her middle name. She should have been allowed to say her mom's name, her dad's name, her kid's name, her dog's name. She should have been allowed to say anything. This should not have been a problem. Like, that is crazy to me. Despite being told by the TMB that complaints are allowed to be filed anonymously, Sheriff Roberts just had this belief that by somebody filing an anonymous complaint, this showed that they had malicious intent. This is why he was so pressed to find out who the author of the anonymous letter was. And this showed that Sheriff Roberts had a faulty understanding of the statute of harassment. For example, Roberts did in fact read the complaint letter that nurse practitioner Naomi had written, but he concluded that she had not done anything wrong, one, because she signed it, and two, because she didn't have anything against Dr. Arafiles, unlike the other two who he claimed did. So that's why he continued trying to pursue an investigation on just the two of them, because by them being anonymous, this was apparently wrong. With this information he now had, Roberts then went on to take his findings to attorney Tidwell. And just that next day, on May 19th, Roberts and his deputy, James Swanson, conducted separate interviews with Nurse Ann and Nurse Vickilyn. He wanted to figure out which one of the two sent the letter. And Wiley had actually provided a room in the hospital that Roberts would be able to use when questioning them. Initially, at the start of each interview, Sheriff Roberts questioned the nurses about the hospital's policies and procedures for filing complaints. And then later during each interview, Roberts read each of the nurses their Miranda warnings and informed them that he wanted to talk about a criminal complaint of harassment. Now, During the course of the investigations, Sheriff Roberts, Deputy Swanson, and Tidwell all met in between the interview of the nurses to debrief Tidwell. And fortunately, none of the interviews went too far because both of the nurses invoked their Fifth Amendment right to counsel, terminating the interviews right then and there before any admission was made. So after they were done completing both of the interviews, Roberts, Swanson, and Tidwell all met again, and during this meeting, they all decided that a search warrant should be obtained for the computers used by both nurses Ann and Vickilyn to determine which of the nurses wrote the letter. Tidwell instructed Deputy Swanson to conduct this search. So Swanson began creating a draft for the search warrant affidavit with assistance from Tidwell, and they brought it to the judge, with it reading in part, quote, "It is the belief of affiant, and he hereby charges and accuses that Ann M. Mitchell or Vickilyn Galle, on or about April of 2009, intentionally and knowingly sent the anonymous letter to the Texas State Medical Board listing complaints against Dr. Rolando Arafiles with the intent to harm or defraud Dr. Rolando Arafiles, and with the intent to harass, alarm, abuse, torment, or embarrass Dr. Rolando Arafiles." The fact that they added embarrass at the end just shows everything that I needed to know about this whole thing. After presenting, the judge signed the search warrant, and Swanson subsequently performed the search that same night on May 19th. Nurse Ann had a computer located at the Winkler County Community Center. This is where she worked her second job as the emergency management coordinator. Swanson went to this very community center that night and collected Nurse Ann's computer. And the following morning, after bringing it to the office, law enforcement personnel searched through this very computer. And after taking a look at the files, they soon seized a letter from the computer to compare with the confidential complaint sent to the TMB. And surely enough, they were able to determine that the letter from the computer did in fact match the one from the confidential complaint. Not too long after this, on May 27th, Sheriff Roberts provided a requested copy of his files to the TMB, and he informed them that the case, quote, had been filed with the Winkler County attorney with a charge of harassment. On that very same day, after the charges were filed, nurses Ann and Vickilyn, alongside their attorneys, went to the sheriff's office to meet with Sheriff Roberts. And at this meeting, Nurse Vickilyn's attorney, Brian Carney, let Sheriff Roberts know that in addition to Ann, Nurse Vickilyn had also been involved in making the anonymous report to the TMB. Up until that point, Sheriff Roberts thought it was just Ann who wrote the letter, as the letter was found on her computer. But it was at that meeting when he learned that it wasn't just one nurse who wrote the letter, but it was the two of them. Now, of course, they went on to discuss the whole reason the complaints were filed in the first place, and they told him about the legal issues occurring at the hospital, which was far more than what we had already even discussed. At the time, the hospital was receiving funding from Medicaid, and Nurse Ann had actually been speaking to someone at the Medicaid program regarding the issue at the hospital. While she was speaking with this person, she learned that based on the criteria, the hospital was not entitled to receive Medicaid funding. Because of this, at the meeting, the nurses gave Sheriff Roberts a written report informing him about the alleged healthcare fraud coming from the hospital themselves. But despite the nurses coming in good faith to report this to what they thought would be an appropriate law enforcement agency, Sheriff Roberts didn't ask them any questions about this because he, quote, had everything he needed. He soon reported his findings to Tidwell, and it was after that when everything kind of started going downhill. After hearing from Roberts, Tidwell set up a meeting with the hospital administrator, Wiley, and at this meeting, he told Wiley, hey, just letting you know, nurses Ann and Vickilyn were the ones who filed the anonymous complaint against Dr. Arafiles to the TMB. And not only this, but the nurses also made a report against you for Medicare fraud. Both Tidwell and Wiley were very concerned and worried about what this would mean for them and the hospital. So in the middle of this meeting, Tidwell reached the phone and he ended up calling a place called the Texas Association of Counties, or TAC. TAC is a nonprofit organization that, quote, finds solutions to challenges faced by all counties in Texas. When they answered, Tidwell was greeted by a TAC employee named Diana Cecil, and he went on to tell Cecil all about the issues going on at the hospital. On this call, he described the nurses as, quote, two problem employees. And he went on to tell Cecil about how the two problem employees from the hospital had made complaints against a doctor through official agencies. And he asked Cecil for advice on how to proceed with this situation. Cecil listened very intently, and from what she was hearing, she was very positive this sounded like a whistleblower case, which, by the way, is very much legal and should not be considered a criminal issue. So she went on to tell Tidwell that this very well could be a whistleblower case, and because of this, she told him that he should immediately contact the TAC legal team to get legal guidance. Most importantly, Cecil also went on to tell Tidwell that, quote, no harm should come to the two employees for making the complaints, because as whistleblowers, they are in their legal right to report something that is wrong. But clearly what we'll find out is that this will be far from the actual case, and harm, in fact, would come to the nurses. Once the conversation ended, Tidwell turned to Wiley and they began discussing what the TAC just said on the phone. And instead of listening to Cecil's advice regarding no harm coming to the employees, Tidwell went on to tell Wiley that even if this was a whistleblower case, he still had the ability to fire the nurses as long as Wiley believed that the nurses filed the complaint in bad faith. Tidwell told Wiley, look, it's up to you if you think the complaints were filed in bad faith. He let Wiley decide, and Wiley replied that he definitely did believe that it was done in bad faith and that he was going to be moving accordingly. It didn't take too long after this, because it was only a few days later on June 1st when Wiley had called a meeting with nurses Ann and Vickilyn, and he fired both of them from the Winkler County Memorial Hospital. At this meeting, he didn't tell them why they were being fired. He just handed them both a termination form stating, quote, your services are no longer required. And he left it at that. He later would admit that he had in fact fired Ann because she filed a report with the TMB, which he believed was done in bad faith because she allegedly had something against Dr. Arafiles and she wanted to just get rid of him. He also stated that he fired Nurse Vickilyn because she insisted on outside peer review of the hospital cases and because she allegedly refused to work with Dr. Arafiles, which, by the way, probably isn't even true because Nurse Vickilyn adamantly denied ever refusing to work with Dr. Arafiles. They weren't fired for doing something wrong. They weren't fired for unsatisfactory job performance. They were fired for making a complaint and requesting peer review while being concerned for patients. In fact, prior to being fired and even after, they weren't even given an opportunity to contest or challenge the termination through a hearing or anything. There was no opportunity for them to present evidence, no opportunity to confront their accusers, nothing. They were not given a proper grievance procedure for their termination. They were just let go with no reason told. Sheriff Roberts soon took all the evidence he gathered in his report and brought it over to Tidwell's office. Together, they reviewed all the findings, and it didn't take long for Tidwell to come up with his conclusion on the case, because he concluded that based on everything found out about this case, that it fit the felony charge of misuse of official information. And after coming up with this conclusion, Tidwell and Roberts went straight to the district attorney's office to speak with Mike Faustel, the district attorney of Winkler County. Sheriff Roberts gave his report to Faustel, showing him that Nurse Ann wrote the letter, and he told him that the only evidence they had against Nurse Vickilyn was the fact that her lawyer had verbally told them this. Shortly after this, Sheriff Roberts appeared before a Winkler County grand jury to present the case and persuade them to indict the nurses Ann and Vickilyn with a third-degree felony offense of misuse of official information. Tidwell helped Faustel's administrative assistant with drafting the indictments, and although Faustel and Tidwell were both present in court, the only witness who testified to the grand jury at the court was Sheriff Roberts. It was shortly after this, just 10 days after being fired on June 11th, when a Winkler County grand jury issued indictments against nurses Ann and Vickilyn for misuse of official information. And both nurses were subsequently arrested before being released on $5,000 bail each. Within the next few days, the TMB became aware of the indictments, and on June 15th, Mary Robinson, the executive director of the TMB, called the Attorney General Fostel to get more information on what was going on. In addition to being the executive director of the TMB, Robinson was also a licensed attorney in Texas. She wanted to know if the indictments were based solely on the fact that the nurses filed a complaint with the TMB, or if there was actual basis in the indictment, especially because with the TMB receiving a complaint on a physician, they had to make sure to look into those actual cases mentioned regarding the physician. She told Fostel, like, hey, I'm concerned about these indictments brought against the nurses. I just want to clarify that the TMB is a governmental agency, and I want to ask you, were the nurses charged because they filed a complaint with the TMB, or was there any other evidence I'm not aware of? At the time of the indictment, the only patient information or government information sent to the TMB were the file numbers of the patients. So she wanted to know if there was more to the case than what she already knew. But instead of cooperating with her request, Fostel refused to discuss this matter with her, and he told her, look, a copy of the case file will be sent over to the defense counsel tomorrow on June 16th. If you want any additional information, you can get whatever you need from the nurses' lawyers. And that's where that conversation ended. Robinson wasn't going to just give up right there, though. So she instead decided to call Tidwell to see if he would be able to answer her questions. When he answered, she expressed her concern about the case and asked him the same things she asked Fostel. But unfortunately, Tidwell also would shut down her request and would instead reply to her, look, I don't need you to explain the law to me. I understand exactly what I'm doing. He too refused to discuss the conversation further, and he even told her that she was starting to sound as if she was the defense counsel for the nurses. Robinson was not satisfied with the responses she received from both Fostel and Tidwell. In her opinion, it seemed as though Tidwell was more knowledgeable on the case, but regardless, none of them were open to answering her questions. So, as Fostel mentioned to do, Robinson reached out to the nurses' lawyers on June 16th to get a copy of the state's files, and after she received this, Robinson's concerns were quickly confirmed. She went on to send a 4-page letter on June 17th, 2009, addressed to both Fostel and Tidwell. Not only was it sent to them two, but a copy of this letter was also sent to various offices and officials of the state, including the executive director of the Texas Board of Nursing, the Texas State Department of Health Services, the Office of the Governor, and the Attorney General. And in this letter, Robinson was not playing with them whatsoever. She told them exactly what the tea was, and she let them know that she was concerned that what was going on wasn't right at all. And she really did gather them up in this letter, but I'm just going to read the most significant parts of it. It read, quote, "The board has many concerns about the above charges. Any such information, if provided to the board, is provided for governmental purposes. Accordingly, the indictment appears to be incorrect in that it asserts that provision of that information was for a non-governmental purpose. Information provided triggering a complaint or furthering an investigation by the board is information provided for a governmental purpose. The regulation of the practice of medicine. We should point out that the nursing board also has rules that require that reporting of physicians who are unable to practice in a manner consistent with public health and welfare. Any complaint with the board is not subject to means of legal compulsion for release to anyone other than the board or its employees or agents involved in discipline of a license holder. The indictments and other documents issued in this prosecution have effectively destroyed the legislatively readed confidentiality that a complainant to the board would have. This action undertaken by your office had adversely impacted the board's investigation by its peace officers in this case. Further, it has potentially created a significant chilling effect on the cooperation of any other hospital personnel who might have been able to provide additional information needed by the board in the completion of its investigation. This is of grave concern to the board in its implications for the case, as well as other cases. A relevant inquiry will be whether that physician engaged in any activity that was designed to intimidate witnesses or complainants. Such activity is a violation of the Act and constitutes unprofessional or dishonorable conduct. If your office is aware of any such evidence, we ask that you make that known to us immediately. Due to the above listed concerns, I contacted both of you regarding this case to seek reassurance that the prosecution of these two individuals was for reasons other than the alleged provision of information to the board. Neither of you felt as though you could give me any information concerning this matter. No such information has been forthcoming. In summary, the board's investigation of the licensee physician in question has been significantly compromised by the actions taken by your offices. We are extremely concerned that this indictment solely relates to the allegation that the nurses in question provided information to the board. We ask for any reassurance that you can give us that this is not the case and allow the board to fulfill its obligations under the act. I'm so sorry. That is my favorite letter because she really said, here are our rules. Here's what's up. Y'all are not helping at all. Y'all are wrong. She said, I've been messaging you guys and nobody's trying to help me out. So here's my letter. Here's the rules. If y'all are doing some messed up stuff, it's going to come to you. That's exactly what she said. And she ate them up. I'm not going to lie. As she should. I know they read that and they were like, I really like that letter. That's why I had to read the whole thing. It's a 4-page letter. There was more to that. There was more. That was just my favorite parts. Tidwell wrote back to Robinson's letter acknowledging that he did in fact understand that a complaint filed with the TMB was for a governmental purpose. But he maintained his argument that there is a possibility that there could be more than one reason somebody might file a complaint, i.e., alluding to the nurses having something against Dr. Arafiles. And he asserted that he intended to let a jury decide whether the complaints were for a governmental purpose or not. And to reply to Robinson's question regarding witness intimidation, Tidwell asserted that to his knowledge, Dr. Arafiles hadn't done such a thing and that he acted appropriately in response to the complaints filed against him. Now, just a couple weeks later, sometime in the beginning of July, as Tidwell had some more time to think about the upcoming case and figure out if it even made any sense, he came up with a grand idea. He said, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't go through with this case. Maybe we should dismiss the charges. But he thought of doing this only under one condition. On July 7th, District Attorney Fostel actually ended up writing a letter that if Nurse Ann or Nurse Vickilyn wanted the felony charges dismissed against them, that they would need to accept being fired from the hospital, they would need to agree to not file any civil action against Winkler County, the hospital, Texas, and any of its entities or employees, and if a case had already been filed by them, they would need to dismiss it immediately with prejudice. Likewise, Tidwell in particular was willing for this to happen if they paid a small fine, did probation, and wrote an apology letter to Dr. Arafiles and the hospital. So essentially, they were telling the nurses, look, we won't charge you as long as you apologize and say you didn't mean it. Contrary to what they hoped, the nurses were not willing to accept this offer. They declined, with Ann stating, quote, they dragged us through all this. We deserved our day in court. Now, around this time in 2009 to 2010, the district attorney, Fostel, had actually developed some significant health problems that would often cause him to be absent from the district attorney's office. So during this time period, instead of taking on the cases himself, Tidwell would often take on the cases in place of him. In 2009 to 2010, Tidwell handled many of the cases and hearings that were intended for Fostel. It actually became such a recurring thing that later on in the year, on December 27th, 2010, Tidwell would actually go on to file a petition to remove Fostel from the office of district attorney, arguing in an affidavit that Fostel had not appeared before a grand jury since March of 2009. A pretrial hearing for the nurses was held in August 2009. Although Fostel appeared in the courtroom during this and should have been the one to handle this case, Tidwell was the one who actually handled the hearing, and he would also be the one to handle the real trial scheduled in February. This is something that's of important note. With being charged with misuse of information, the nurses not only faced up to $5,000 in fines, but they faced up to 10 years in prison. But this sentencing would only be determined months later when their trial was scheduled for February 8th, 2010. During those months leading up to the trial, the whole of Winkler County was just shaken up to its core. These two nurses were very respected in their community. They worked a combined 47 years at this hospital, and they were highly regarded at this hospital, even by their own administrator who fired them. The entire town was polarized by this case, and nurses Ann and Vickilyn were now not only out of a job, but they had their entire reputation stained by this case. They described struggling to find a job. They described having people turn their heads every time they simply walked into a local restaurant for lunch. Not only this, but they had to go to court, and court is not free. They were draining into their savings because they now had to pay legal fees, fill out documents, and just do a whole bunch of things they probably never would have expected would happen simply for trying to help out their patients and not only do their job as a nurse, but for doing their job as a human being to report something when they see that something is wrong. Nurse Ann's lawyer, John Cook, brought up a very valid point. He stated, quote, "If something serious had happened to one of the patients, the state would have come in and they would have asked Ann Mitchell, why didn't you report any of this? You're the compliance officer. This is your job. At the very least, she could have lost her license." Fortunately, the community had the nurses back because throughout the months waiting for the trial, the Texas and National Nurses Associations not only defended the nurses by calling the prosecution an outrage, but they also raised $47,000 contributed to by almost 700 nurses and doctors spanning 44 different states for the nurses' legal defense. And surely enough, after a few months, February came around and things were ready for trial. Now, in a turn of events, just the week before the scheduled trial, things did take a little bit of a turn because Tidwell, as prosecutor, decided to dismiss the charges filed against Nurse Vickilyn. However, he didn't dismiss the charges against Nurse Ann, and he was fully prepared to bring Nurse Ann to court. This wasn't the only change that happened in this trial. The location of the court was also changed from Winkler County to Andrews County, which is about an hour or so away. And this meant that they weren't in Tidwell's county anymore. So because of this change, Tidwell ended up asking the Andrews County attorney, John Poole, to assist him with jury selection. But this is where things got a little bit odd. Poole agreed to assist Tidwell, and the two of them began looking over Nurse Ann and Nurse Vickilyn's cases to discuss it. But as they were discussing the case, Poole just continued listening to the evidence that Tidwell was presenting. And as he was hearing this, Poole was just thinking, there's absolutely no evidence for this case. And so Tidwell presented the evidence and was like, hey, what do you think? And Poole replied to him, honestly, hate to break it to you, but I don't think you actually have a good case. I mean, there's no evidence that the complaint had been filed for a non-governmental purpose. And he was just telling Tidwell that there was no proof for whatever he was claiming. Based on their discussions, he told Tidwell that he should dismiss the case against Nurse Ann. But despite being told this, Tidwell did not seem to want to listen to Poole's advice. He insisted, and he instead told Poole that he hadn't heard all the evidence yet and that he was going to find it all out in court. And he refused to dismiss the case. Tidwell continued on with the trial against Nurse Ann, and everyone showed up on that Monday of February 8th to get down to the bottom of this case. This trial went on for 4 days, and at this trial, Tidwell presented the state in place of Fostel. As the trial progressed, Poole again was telling Tidwell that he did not have a case against Nurse Ann, and he again told him that he should dismiss the case. But Tidwell continued arguing to Poole that he did have the evidence. He cited that Nurse Ann apparently called Dr. Arafiles a, quote, witch doctor, and he said this in part was evidence to prove his point. But Poole just replied to him like, those are her personal feelings. Personal feelings about Dr. Arafiles or her subjective intent in filing the complaint is irrelevant because at the end of the day, her filing the report with the TMB was for a governmental purpose, for the proper practice of medicine to be put in place. Still, Tidwell did not dismiss the case. He acknowledged that it is a nurse's job to report wrongdoing of doctors onto patients, but he claimed that when Nurse Ann sent in that complaint, she was not doing it in good faith of the patients. Tidwell argued that Dr. Arafiles had been subjected to, quote, a consistent pattern of harassment by Ann, stating the following, quote, we know what her purpose was. We've heard from other nurses at the facility. It was a personal vendetta. It started from day one. She didn't get her way and blocked Dr. Arafiles from being hired. And Mr. Wiley told you from day one she didn't like him, and it got worse day by day by day. This was a personal vendetta, starting on day one. The case is very simple. The case is about one thing. It's about a public servant that let personal animosity drive her decisions. That's all it's about. Very simple. He also referenced Anne calling Arafiles an SOB, stating, quote, "It is not appropriate to say the doctor is an SOB, and that indicates personal animosity." Reading everything Tidwell said in the transcript, to sum it up, was pretty much just, this is a personal vendetta. What was it that drove this nurse to act on such a personal vendetta? Literally, that is, if you read the transcript, which is in the description, that was his main argument. He never explained the reasoning behind this personal vendetta, nor did he provide evidence that showed she had a personal vendetta against him. On the other hand, in her defense, Nurse Anne's lawyer, John Cook, made it clear that Anne did her duty as a nurse to report issues regarding patient safety and abuse, and he called out the abuse of authority of those trying to get her in trouble for doing her job. In court, the defense questioned Dr. Arafiles on things like his relationship with Sheriff Roberts, his business selling Zri, and even about the medical mistakes he made in the hospital. Just an interesting note, when discussing the medical mistakes he made, the defense and prosecution actually agreed to give these cases nicknames, which included things like turkey toe, appendix boy, rubber fingertip, and skin graft. In his defense, specifically regarding the rubber fingertip case, Dr. Arafiles claimed it was an accident, stating that he had the patient brace their hand on a suturing kit and just accidentally sewed their finger to it. And when discussing the skin graft case, Dr. Arafiles actually made some comments that sparked a reaction in the court. It's relatively common knowledge to medical professionals that patients with diabetes may have a harder time recovering from things like illnesses, cuts, or wounds in comparison to patients without diabetes. This is something health providers keep in mind when doing procedures on somebody with diabetes so they can take the right steps in helping with the healing process. But when the defense asked if there was a difference in recovery between someone with diabetes and someone without diabetes, Dr. Arafiles said no, showing that when he did the skin graft on the patient, he wasn't considering their health history whatsoever. When he answered this, the audience started gasping and laughing. There were actually many moments like this during the trial, to the point where the judge had to request that the audience be quiet, or else he'd have to remove people from the courtroom. Nurse Anne didn't testify in court, but her lawyer, John Cook, stated the following, quote, "A doctor who will not admit his mistakes has no honor. A doctor who blames everybody for the harm and pain that he causes and will not learn from his mistakes is dangerous. Courage is sacrificing yourself to protect others. Anne Mitchell is a woman of courage. She did what she had to do, knowing that she would be retaliated against because this man was a friend of powers that be in that town. Shame on them for abusing their public trust. Shame on them for using the powers entrusted to them by us for their own personal gains and wishes. Shame on them for seeking to destroy professionals who for more than 20 years gave them their labors, their hearts, and their soul. Shame on them for not having the honor to admit their mistakes. Shame on them for subjecting all Texans to ridicule by their boss hog mentality." All in all, from this trial, Arafiles would admit the cases in question did happen. Roberts would admit approaching patients for the investigation and using the nurse's confidential letter for the investigation, both of which, if you remember, the TMB said was illegal. And get this, Tidwell, the prosecutor himself, would admit that he, in fact, was the personal attorney of not just the hospital, but also the personal attorney of Roberts and Dr. Arafiles, meaning he essentially had no business prosecuting this case. This jury looked over this case, and it took them less than 1 hour to come to a conclusion. In fact, according to Saul Elbine from the Texas Observer, it took them less than 5 minutes to come to this conclusion. They were just in the room meeting for 1 hour, but in 5 minutes, they knew what they were going to be deciding anyway. At the end of this 4-day trial, on February 11th, 2010, the jury acquitted Nurse Anne, as they found that Nurse Anne was not guilty of anything for reporting Dr. Arafiles, and the charges against her were dropped. Most people in the court supported the nurses. In fact, it was said that after the verdict was made, all the jurors went up to Nurse Anne and gave her a hug. While this was obviously great news, it truly just brought up the issues with protecting nurses and healthcare workers regarding whistleblowing situations. The actions of those involved in this case clearly violated not only the Texas Occupations Code, but also the Texas Whistleblower Act, an act that, quote, protects public employees who make good faith reports of violations of law by their employer to an appropriate law enforcement authority. This clearly is not what happened for these nurses, and it left a large impact on them. Which is wild because just a few months after this trial, on April 12th, the hospital was actually disciplined for some violations and deficiencies they had. Because before Nurse Ann's trial even happened, on September 9th, 2009, the Texas Department of State Health Services, or DSHS, cited the hospital for a number of deficiencies they had regarding following the conditions of participation in the Medicare program established by the Social Security Act. So, as Ann was telling Roberts when they first met, like, oh, by the way, there's some Medicare issues going on. What do you know? She was correct. And many of the other deficiencies were ones that were pointed out by nurses Ann, Vickilyn, and nurse practitioner Naomi. One specifically that was cited was a case where a patient had gastrointestinal or GI bleeding and waited at the emergency department for nearly 3.5 hours before being transferred to a facility with a higher level of care. In this case, the patient passed away at the accepting hospital. I tried looking more into this case, but I couldn't find more on it or much on it at all, unfortunately. Not only this, but the hospital was also cited for violating the statutes which should have prohibited nurses Ann and Vickilyn from being fired simply for reporting violations to the TMB. Because of these violations and deficiencies, on April 12, 2010, the DSHS imposed administrative penalties against the hospital. And while the hospital initially tried silencing the nurses from filing a civil suit, they did in fact file a civil suit a few months later after the trial ended on April 18th, 2010. In the lawsuit, they filed 9 claims of relief alleging violations of their constitutional right to free speech and due process, illegal retaliation, and improper termination. This lawsuit was brought against Winkler County, Wiley, Roberts, Tidwell, Fostel, and Arafiles. At the end of all of this, the nurses settled their lawsuit and were awarded $750,000 to be split with one another, so $375,000 each. Not only this, but the hospital was also made to pay a $15,850 fine imposed by the Texas Department of State Health Services regarding their role in inadequately supervising Dr. Arafiles and for firing Nurse Ann and Vickilyn. But even though they were able to settle this civil suit, those involved would soon face criminal legal action for the role they played in the retaliation against the nurses and just work in general. On June 22, 2010, the TMB filed a formal complaint against Dr. Arafiles for unprofessional conduct, retaliation, and witness intimidation against the nurses, and for the improper treatment of 9 patients. To be exact, in this complaint, they mentioned issues regarding, quote, poor medical judgment, non-therapeutic prescribing, failure to maintain adequate records, overbilling, witness intimidation, and other violations. Because of this, on February 4th, 2011, the TMB entered a mediated agreed order. His license was suspended, he was placed on probation for 4 years, he was fined $5,000, and he was ordered to take remedial medical education courses by the TMB. Not only was he facing discipline from the TMB, but he was also facing some criminal charges, because on December 21st, 2010, Dr. Arafiles was arrested and charged with 2 counts each of retaliation and misuse of official information, which, by the way, are 3rd-degree felonies. And it wasn't just him, because shortly after this, the same fate came for Sheriff Roberts and Attorney Tidwell. Both of them were facing 6 counts each, 2 counts of 3rd-degree felonies of retaliation, misuse of official information, and official oppression. Additionally, hospital administrator Stan Wiley was also indicted on 2 3rd-degree felonies of retaliation and a misdemeanor of abuse of official capacity. And the 3 of them were all booked into the Winkler County Jail on January 18th, 2011, before bonding out. The court found that by Winkler County firing the nurses, they showed that they, quote, implemented employment policies and practices which are arbitrary, capricious, discriminatory, and have no rational basis. And they found that these policies and practices have subjected the nurses to unequal treatment, stating that the hospital's, quote, employment policies and practices discriminate on the basis of exercising their freedom of speech and doing what the law allows them to do. Also, even though he wasn't charged with anything, court documents state that Fostel himself also actively participated in the criminal case, especially as he allowed Tidwell to prosecute the case on his behalf as an unsworn special prosecutor, which is a person who is not bound by an oath to tell the truth. This makes sense because there were definitely too many personal elements between Tidwell, Roberts, Arafiles, and Wiley for Tidwell to not be an unbiased prosecutor. There should have been a completely different prosecutor for the case, not somebody who was friends with or had some kind of relationship with those involved. Tidwell was the personal attorney for Roberts and Arafiles. It didn't make sense that he was the prosecutor for the case. The first of the four to go to trial was the administrator, Stan Wiley. His trial went on a couple months later, and eventually on March 21st, 2011, Wiley pled guilty to a lesser misdemeanor charge of abuse of official capacity in exchange for his cooperation in helping with the prosecution of the others. He was sentenced and spent 30 days in jail and was also fined $2,000, and he agreed to testify truthfully against the others if called as a witness, which did in fact happen, as he would go on to help testify against Roberts and Tidwell. Next in court was Roberts. He was facing 4 felonies and 2 misdemeanors, and on June 14th, 2011, it actually took the jury less than 2 hours to convict Roberts on all 6 of the charges. As a result, Roberts was removed from office. He was fined $6,000. He received 4 years of felony probation. And get this, he was sentenced to spend 100 days in the very same jail he ran for 20 years. As for County Attorney Scott Tidwell, he opted for the judge to assess his sentencing as opposed to a jury, and he too was convicted on all 6 charges on October 4th, 2011. Tidwell was sentenced to 120 days in jail, 10 years of probation, and was given a $6,000 fine. He too was removed from the office. Finally, Dr. Arafiles was the last one to have his day in court on November 7th, 2011. He ended up entering a guilty plea, pleading guilty to 2 counts of misuse of official information, and in turn having the other 2 charges dismissed. He was sentenced to 2 months in jail, 5 years of probation, and a $5,000 fine. Not only this, but 3 days before his plea, he actually agreed to surrender his medical license to the TMB. This was quite significant considering up until that year before the sentencing, he was actually still working as a physician. In February 2011, when the TMB suspended his license, he was still allowed to practice medicine just with board monitoring. In fact, he was still reported as working at the Winkler County Hospital until his contract ran out in April 2011. And it said even in June of that year, he had moved his practice to East Texas with the Cosby, Germany Hospital in Grand Saline. He was only allowed to fully keep his license as long as he passed a TMB exam on laws and board rules governing medical practice within the next 12 months. But finally, with his license now surrendered, he wasn't able to work as a physician any longer. While everyone seemed to accept their convictions, the old attorney, Scott Tidwell, seemed to have other plans in mind, because on February 13th, 2012, he actually ended up appealing his convictions, but after more than a year passed, he decided it was best to just resign from the bar so that he could avoid any additional discipline. On December 4th, 2013, they affirmed his conviction, and a little bit later, on August 29th, 2014, Tidwell ended up resigning from the bar. The reaction to this case is very interesting in how it varied depending on who you asked. While you might think most people were rooting for the nurses, which for the most part was true, there were still people who were against the nurses, especially those from the Winkler County community. Saul Elbine from the Texas Observer article sat down with both nurses Ann and Vickilyn and even interviewed staff at the hospital. And in the article, he wrote the following: "Most of the current staff I interviewed at the hospital expressed anger with Mitchell and Galle, whom they blame for making Winkler Memorial look bad." Shortly after Arafiles' arrest, the hospital's director of nursing, Donna Pale, sent a letter to the Winkler Post, Winkler's online newspaper, arguing that Mitchell and Galle had made nurses' lives more difficult. She stated, quote, "We have found ourselves in the position of policing the physicians because we are under such scrutiny," she wrote. It is not a nursing function to police the physicians, and we will no longer be doing this. But policing the physicians is an essential nursing function. The hospital's new compliance officer, the one who replaced Mitchell, is Peggy Armstrong. When I asked her about Arafiles, she said, "He's a great doctor. Great. You shouldn't believe the bad press." I asked Armstrong where the bad press had come from. She rolled her eyes, and she ended up saying, "Oh, you know, just a bunch of vindictive, small-town people." It was very clear in this case the protection and backing Dr. Arafiles had by people who were powerful in the community, whether it be the sheriff, the administrator, the president of the hospital board, or the county attorney. Most of the people he would have needed to be on his side were on his side. But that just brings the question of why was it that they were so keen on protecting him? Some argued that they genuinely thought that he was a good employee who was being unfairly targeted. This is something that Wiley himself testified in court. And as you can see, staff members have said the same thing, that he's a great doctor and there's people out to get him. But if you remember what we were discussing earlier, nurse practitioner Naomi claimed that from the beginning of Wiley working at the hospital, he shared his intentions were to bring in more revenue for the hospital. So it's speculated that the reason Wiley wanted to protect him so much was because Arafiles was helping him do just that. Saul Elbine stated the following, quote, "Arafiles was ordering lots of expensive, unnecessary tests and admitting patients to the hospital whether or not they needed to be there. When one man came in with an earache, Naomi Warren recalls, Arafiles ordered close to $1,000 in lab tests, with her stating, quote, "Arafiles never sent that man the lab results," she says, "and he never looked at his ear." The Texas Medical Board would later cite 3 instances in which Arafiles did unnecessary genitourinary exams on women who had come in with sinus or thyroid complaints. So the speculation is that the reason they wanted to keep him around at the hospital is because he was a doctor who was willing to bill unnecessary expensive treatments, and this was bringing in money to the hospital. And I guess looking at it from that lens, in Arafiles' case, he was probably getting a good deal because the hospital couldn't care less if he was selling his own products to patients. So he too was making money and was allowed to keep doing so. But a case like this has such detrimental effects on nurses and the medical field in general. Jim Willman, head counsel for the Texas Nurses Association, stated the following, quote, "If a nurse can get criminally indicted for reporting unsafe care to a licensing board, it's going to have a chilling effect on their ability to report anywhere. The primary role of nurses is to advocate for their patients. They're the healthcare provider with the patient the majority of the time. If the nurse isn't there to speak up for the patients are going to be harmed." So what came of all of this in the future? As for updates, on October 4, 2010, a few months after Nurse Ann was acquitted, Wiley shocked the entire hospital as he abruptly quit his job as hospital administrator at Winkler County to move to Lubbock. As for Roberts, despite being removed from office, Roberts was still able to retire from the county with full benefits. No longer being able to practice medicine, in May 2011, Arafiles started a new LinkedIn as an independent health, wellness, and fitness professional. However, currently, a few years later, Arafiles unfortunately passed away on January 30th, 2014 of a stroke in Bonita, California at age 61. As for Scott Tidwell, he seems to have turned a new leaf. He currently works as a pastor, and he also does work for a faith-based disaster and humanitarian relief nonprofit organization where he cooks and prepares meals for those affected by natural disasters and emergencies. It looks like he is trying to give back to the community, so that is good. And I'm unsure about Wiley and Roberts currently. After the case, despite being viewed as heroes in the nursing world, nurses Ann and Vickilyn still struggled to find employment despite applying to multiple nursing jobs. In January 2011, Nurse Ann told Saul the following, quote, "They ruined my career, they ruined her career. I mean, where are we going to go? We both have lives here." She described how being known as a whistleblower made things difficult, stating, quote, "They're all patting you on the back. They're all giving you accolades. No one wants to hire you. Hospitals think it's great that oversight happens. They're happy to implement changes from other places, but no one wants it coming from their facility. No one wants anyone looking at their doctors." At that time, Ann was still working part-time as the emergency management coordinator. And by the summer of 2012, she went on to find a position in New Mexico working with those who have developmental disabilities. Nurse Vickilyn ended up involuntarily retiring at age 55, stating, quote, "I loved my job. I thought I was going to work until I retired, then work part-time in the clinic. I guess that didn't work out." Both nurses Ann and Vickilyn would be acknowledged with different awards and recognitions. In 2010, the nurses both ended up receiving the Dean's Advocacy Award from the Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center. I'm unsure how they're doing now, but the latest picture available of Vickilyn was from 2017 with her husband and grandchildren, I assume, but I couldn't find anything else. This whole case is just so messy and honestly was very avoidable. Let's look at it from the doctors and hospitals' perspective. Let's say Arafiles genuinely believed he was allowed to perform those procedures on patients, and that's why he did those procedures in the first place. I'm not saying that's true, but let's say hypothetically that is the case. Making mistakes is part of being human. Now, obviously, when it comes to people's health, we do need to be more careful in saying, "Oh, sorry, I didn't know," isn't an excuse, but that's not even where the main issue comes up. The issue is that there were people, the chief of staff, nurses, a nurse practitioner, telling you, "Hey, this isn't okay." As soon as they said that, it should have been, "Oh my gosh, what am I doing wrong? How can I fix it?" As the hospital board of control heard this, they should have been like, "Oh, we really need to evaluate how things are being run here." But instead, it turned into this gigantic court case. Personal opinions on somebody or calling somebody an SOB doesn't mean you have a personal vendetta against them. At the end of the day, what actually mattered is the fact that patients were being harmed. That's it. If all they did was say that they didn't like Arafiles and that he's this, that, and the third, that's a different story. Still wouldn't consider it criminal, but that's different. In a case like that, Stan Wiley could have fired them for bullying or what have you. But these nurses quite literally wrote examples of multiple patients with evidence from their charts and everything. They clearly showed that the patients weren't being treated correctly. And they clearly showed that the hospital had several deficiencies in their operations. But the defendants seem to miss all of that and laser focused on this one narrative that they didn't even have proof of. There was no proof of Nurse Ann or Vickilyn having something against Dr. Arafiles. Everything they stated solely had to do with his standard of care and the standard the hospital was being run at. And truthfully, if the hospital's board of control just listened and did something about the deficiencies, none of this would have had to happen. This story really just opened eyes to how far people can go when they have powerful backup behind them. And it's wild to imagine how many nurses or medical professionals are out there trying to speak up on issues but are being silenced. And you want to know what's very interesting, even after all this happening? By the end of this case, on May 31st, 2011, the Texas Governor Rick Perry actually signed a new law stating that complaints made against physicians to the Texas Medical Board were not allowed to be anonymous anymore. And this law went into effect on September 1st, 2011. With this new law, however, those who filed the complaints are allowed to have their identity kept confidential from the physician as long as they request to do so. The only identities who have to be revealed to the physician are complaints filed by insurance agents, insurers, pharmaceutical companies, or third-party administrators. But for anyone else, they can consent for their identity to not be disclosed. Physicians' rights groups viewed this as a victory for doctors, whereas many others argued that this new law would prevent or discourage people from making legitimate complaints against doctors, especially considering that 4% of the almost 7,000 complaints filed in 2010 were anonymous. Maybe with this case, though, it will show those in charge in the hospitals that they can't fire somebody for making a complaint, nor can they bring a criminal case against them. So hopefully, even if people aren't anonymous anymore, they can feel confident to file complaints knowing they'll still be backed up by the law. I'm just glad the jury and the entire state were able to see the abuse of power going on and were able to make sure that the correct actions were taken in this case. I guess for the defendants, I hope this was a huge lesson learned for them. Hopefully with a case like this, more higher ups can think twice before trying to cover up poor behavior. And I hope nurses or other medical professionals are able to gain a voice and see that the tables most definitely can turn when they unfortunately are working under people who are corrupt. But yes, that is it for today's case. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you think everyone's sentencing was reasonable? Do you think the complaints to the board should be allowed to be anonymous? Please comment your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.